In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being with him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Amen.
Amen.
Please be seated. Merry Christmas, everybody. Those words have to be some of the most beautiful poetry anywhere, no matter what language. And even if you're not a poet or a lover of language, the sheer immensity of the idea has to just knock you back. John's Gospel was originally written in Greek, and word, as in the beginning was the Word, comes to us from the Greek as the word logos. Philosopher and blogger Justin Taylor explains that in ancient Greek, logos has many meanings, but none of those meanings point back to a collection of sounds or a collection of letters that have a certain meaning, like word. Instead, the biblical Greek logos meant something way bigger than that, than just some letters or a sound. Logos referred to the power of reason, the natural order of things, and the principles of relation and harmony, which exist both within the natural fabric of the universe and within the human mind. The idea of logos refers to the underlying order of the universe, the blueprint on which all creation is based. In short, logos is the mind and order of God. The author of John's Gospel is saying that in the beginning with God was not a human or a fleshly man, but a harmony and natural order of the whole world of everything. In the fall of 2018, David Bentley Hart published what a reviewer in The Atlantic called a mind-bending translation of the New Testament. Hart called the translation of logos as the word a curiously bland and impenetrable designation for the heady concept expressed in the original Greek of the Gospels as logos. And he suggested that the word is more usefully translated so that we can really understand its meaning as the creative energy or the activity of God. And the beautiful poetry of John's Gospel's first words is a powerful way of expressing God's presence on earth as Jesus, God incarnate. Matthew's Gospel introduces us to Jesus with a long genealogy. We talked about that in Gathering Circle on Thursday night, with a long genealogy that begins with Abraham and extends to Joseph, including all of our heroes of the faith in between. Jacob, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, Mary, mother of God, and Joseph, her husband. Anybody notice anything about the ones I lifted up?
Amen.
Anybody see the women buried in that name? There's a way in which Matthew's Gospel tricks us a little bit and makes us think it's all about the patriarchy. But not only are those 4 women included in there, they're all women who were outside of the patriarchy, specifically outside of the patriarchy. And we'll talk about them another day, but I wanted to call attention to them. Mark's Gospel begins with the excited announcement. All of them have a different way of telling us how Jesus breaks into the world and announcing he's come. Mark's Gospel begins with this breathless, it's not even a sentence, he can't get a whole sentence out. The good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And he moves directly into Jesus' earthly ministry. Luke's Gospel begins with the birth narrative that we read on Christmas Eve about Mary and Joseph's long trek to Bethlehem to be counted for the census. But John's Gospel is different. Instead of focusing on Jesus' arrival as God incarnate in the form of a human baby, John's Gospel starts with Jesus' origin, with God and in God, part of the natural fabric, the integrating fabric of the whole universe. Jesus is the creative energy or activity of God. Jesus was in the beginning with God and is God. John's gospel turns our gaze from our own place on earth and our own context to God's creative energy and our place in that energy as people of God. John's gospel fully embraces the mystery of divinity, a mystery that is not easy to communicate, right? Not easy to communicate, express, or explain. And the four gospels do it in four different ways. Poetry, music, and art can help us to express what is absolutely true but difficult to say, and even more difficult to understand. One example, when I spent a year in Palestine and Israel, I saw many, many Orthodox churches filled with icons. Very detailed and elaborate paintings of Jesus, John the Baptist, and other figures of the faith. But it took some work and some real understanding and study before I was able to read those icons. The murals and the frescoes in those 1,500-year-old churches, to begin to understand how they work in faith. What icons do is what John's gospel does. Tries to express the deep mystery in a way that can enter our consciousness non-verbally, in ways that are to express ideas that are bigger than our understandings and our capacity for human reason. And that's why we don't say icons are painted. We say icons are written, or even better, icons are created. Icon writers who are faithful artists and theologians, they retreat to their icons and pray their icons, trying to plumb the mystery of a theological claim, to express that claim visually. They know that words can't reach the deepest truths in our hearts, just like the English translation of the word doesn't begin to touch the breadth and depth of the theological truth that Logos is the creative energy or activity of God. And the best way I can think of to convey this idea now is to describe some ways that Mary is painted in icons in the Holy Lands. You know that Moses experienced God in the burning bush, the bush that burned and yet was not consumed. And you know that the book of Exodus tells us the story of the Ark of the Covenant that contained the stone tablets that God gave Moses, and also was where God had God's presence. The Ark and the stone tablets represented God's presence among the people. And it's not uncommon to see Mary painted in these icons in Orthodox or Roman Catholic settings in Eastern churches, surrounded or even overlaid with images of the burning bush and the Ark of the Covenant. Because Mary, the word for it in Greek is Theotokos, God-bearer, because Mary bore God. She was the bush that was burned but yet was not consumed. She was the ark that contained the law and God's presence. The image expresses the theological claim that Mary is that carrier of God. There's one image at the entrance to Mount Sinai Monastery in the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt that shows Mary holding Jesus in her arms in the center of the burning bush. So the shape echoes the shape of the flames. So it looks like Mary the God-bearer, and Jesus were part of the creative energy and activity of God in the bush that burned but did not consume the bush. And John's Gospel says this with words and poetry and makes us central to that energy and that creation. What if we tell the story of how God came down at Christmas like John's Gospel does? In the beginning was the creative energy of God, and this energy was the very activity of God and was itself God. All things came into being from this natural order that is presented in both the universe and the human mind. And without this natural order in God's activity, not one thing came into being. What God's energy has brought into being is life. And the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it.